As a country, what I'm really excited about for us is that our youngest generation, Gen Z in particular, are the most diverse generation we've ever seen in this country.
That's the voice of Mana Kharrazi, Rapid Response Campaign Director for MoveOn. She's today's guest on Press the Button, a Plowshares Fund podcast dedicated to nuclear policy and national security. And now, here are your co-hosts, Michelle Dover and Tom Kalina.
Welcome back to Press the Button. This past Saturday marked the spring equinox, which is also the beginning of the Iranian New Year. We here at Plowshares Fund want to wish our listeners a happy Nowruz. We hope you have a happy and prosperous New Year.
Hi, Michelle. Happy Nowruz and happy spring to everyone. Here in DC, we're getting ready for the cicadas that rise every 17 years. And this cycle is expected to be a doozy. Fun fact, there will be 1.5 million cicadas per acre of land. Wrap your mind around that number. So get ready for the swarm.
Oh, and the noise. But anyway, Tom, what do you have lined up for us on early warning?
Today, we're looking at the United Kingdom's new defense policy. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson wants to increase his nuclear arsenal based on new warheads to be developed with the Biden administration. We'll discuss the international reactions to this proposal and what role the United States might play in this. All that and more on today's Early Warning.
After that, I sit down with Mana Kharrazi, Rapid Response Campaign Director for MoveOn. In addition to her work fighting the Muslim ban and leading anti-war efforts, Mana has worked for years with youth and refugee communities. So we sit down to talk about her work as a community leader addressing racial justice issues. And she talks more about how movement work has changed in the South and among different generations. It's a really timely conversation about what is driving change right now, and I can't wait for you all to hear it. You'll also hear more about last week's shootings in Atlanta and why it shows an inherent need to understand the domestic side of foreign policy.
And as usual, if you like what you hear, please remember to hit subscribe and leave us a rating. Every little bit helps to grow our show and our audience, and we really appreciate it. If you have a question that you want to get answered on the air, shoot us a DM at PressButtonPod or send us an email at pressthebutton@plowshares.org. And with that, let's get into today's episode. The clock is ticking.
And now, early warning, early warning, early warning, early warning. A 7-minute synopsis of this week's nuclear news.
Thanks, Del. The United Kingdom has just released a wide-ranging review of its defense policy. And for a nation that likes to be in step with the United States, the new British policy seems much more in line with the Trump administration than the new Biden team. And in particular, the Conservatives, led by Prime Minister Boris Johnson, are proposing to increase the UK nuclear arsenal by about 40%, based on a new nuclear warhead to be developed in close cooperation with Washington. But the Biden administration has yet to approve this new warhead. To help us understand all this, we have with us Sebastian Brixey-Williams. He is co-director of the British American Security Information Council. Sebastian, welcome.
Well, thanks, Tom. Thanks for having me on board.
First, if you could give us some context for the UK policy review, and why do you think it proposes to expand the British nuclear arsenal?
Yeah, sure. Well, why the UK has chosen now to increase the nuclear arsenal cap is open to some interpretation. And I've seen a handful of reasons put forwards. Now, the integrated review itself states that the increase was made in, quote, recognition of the evolving security environment, including the developing range of technological and doctrinal threats. Now, that's fair enough, but it's obviously deliberately vague. And it doesn't tell you what 260 warheads could do that 180 couldn't. Now, one compelling rationale is the idea that Lawrence Freedman and others have put forward that this allows the UK to put 2 fully armed Trident subs at sea at once, i.e. 16 missiles per boat, 8 warheads per missile, 2 boats on patrol. That makes 256 warheads, which you can round up to 260, perhaps because it's a round number, perhaps to add a bit more redundancy and ambiguity into the mix. Another suggestion is that the UK is preempting the next round of arms control. So Russia is insisting that any future arms control needs to involve France and the UK in response to the US proposals to include China. Now, if the UK really was fielding a minimum credible deterrent, then that would be a problem for any future arms control it's involved in. But there's a third rationale that I think we can't fully discount. What if in this case the decision was just taken by the Prime Minister? We know the IR went all the way up the chain. And what if this was taken by Boris Johnson without regard to the non-proliferation and disarmament regime and has had to be retrospectively justified by the civil service? We know that the Johnson government was willing to threaten to deliberately break international law during the Brexit negotiations, for example. So is being a bigger nuclear weapons power that can throw its weight around a bit more part of Johnson's vision for global Britain? I hope not, but it's not too difficult a conclusion to draw.
And how have domestic and international observers reacted to this? And do you expect these plans to change?
Well, from what I can see, people are really surprised by the increase, especially that it's as big as it seems to be, at almost 45%. I'm particularly dismayed that the UK has also announced that it will no longer give public figures for its operational stockpile, its deployed warheads, or its deployed missile numbers. I think nationally there is some sympathy for the fact that the security environment has worsened. But the UK has responded to this by increasing the salience of nuclear weapons in its own security doctrine, rather than looking for alternative ways to ensure its security. And I think there's a feeling among many of us that these moves run counter to the spirit, if not also the letter, of the disarmament pillar of the NPT. So here in the UK and overseas, there were quite a lot of people, I think, that were hoping the UK might be able to continue to lead the nuclear weapons states by its good example, by minimizing its numbers, tightening its declaratory policy, maximizing its transparency, and so on. But this announcement really reverses that trend now and raises important questions about what the UK really understands its responsibilities to be.
Now, these plans in the UK have raised attention to a particular part of this, which is that the UK plans to arm its missiles with new warheads developed jointly with the United States. And this may come as a surprise to some who are not familiar with the history, but there's a long history here. And can you give us some background on the US-UK special relationship?
Yeah, absolutely. So the US-UK Mutual Defence Agreement of 1958 provides the basis for the two countries' bilateral nuclear cooperation. And it's the most extensive cooperation treaty of its sort in the world. It's renewed every few years, next time in 2024. And because of the UK's reliance on the US for technologies, materials, and skills, it provides Washington with a great deal of leverage over the UK programme whenever it's up for renewal. I think it's worth remembering that although the integrated review claims that the British nuclear weapons are operationally independent, people like Dan Plesh and others in the UK have really shown that they are heavily dependent on the states at the design and the industrial level. So, for example, the UK's Trident missiles are drawn from and maintained in a common pool at the US Strategic Weapons Facility in Kings Bay, Georgia. And of course, the UK's current Holbrooke warhead is believed to be heavily based on the W76-0. And Hans Christensen has pointed out that this is even part of the Department of Energy's W76 needs maintenance schedule. So the question that I think everyone is asking at the moment is how reliant is the UK's new warhead design on the US's W93, which is currently up for discussion as to whether that program is going forwards.
And do we know how closely these warhead designs, the US W93 and the proposed British warhead, how close those designs are, and what might the alternatives be for the British program if the US would choose not to proceed with the W93?
Yeah, good question. So it's not entirely clear. Analysts in the UK like Matthew Harries at RUSI and David Cullen at the Nuclear Information Service are doing research into the relationships between the UK's new warhead and the US W93 program to try and tease this out a bit. We already know it's going to use the US-developed Mk7 Aeroshell re-entry vehicle. And given the massive amount of lobbying that UK officials are currently doing on the Hill, it does look as though the W93 design is hugely important for the UK's new warhead. But the questions that need to be answered are, to what extent is the UK warhead not just aligned with, but actually contingent on the W93? And if it is, how appropriate is it for US taxpayers to be footing the bill for a large part of that R&D? You ask about the alternatives. Well, in theory, if the UK is indeed a nuclear sovereign, it could go it alone. But there are big questions as to whether the country really has the capacity and the expertise to do any of this anymore. Alternatively, they could drop the idea of developing their own variant, and they could ask very nicely if they could use US warheads directly. But obviously, that would be an even bigger hit to the idea of the UK's independent deterrent. And politically, I think that would be very difficult for the UK.
There is the siren. We need to end it there because we're out of time. Sebastian, thank you so much for being here.
It's a pleasure, Tom.
Hi, my name is Elizabeth Warner, and I'm the Managing Director of Plowshares Fund. Even though I've been working in the nuclear field for nearly 9 years, there is still so much to learn. That's why I'm a dedicated listener of Press the Button. I so appreciate each episode where I can get the top stories of the week and a deeper dive into critical conversations with thought leaders and experts in nuclear policy and national security. I'm also a proud supporter of Plowshares Fund. Did you know that many of the guests featured on Press the Button are supported by Plowshares? Since our founding 40 years ago, all of our work is made possible by individuals just like you. Curious, committed, passionate. If you like what you're hearing on Press the Button and want to support the work of Plowshares Fund, please donate today. Whether it's $5, $50, $500, your generosity helps create a safer future free from the threat of nuclear weapons. Visit plowshares.org today to make a donation. Or join me and make it monthly. Whatever you do, stay informed, stay safe, and stay connected. Together, we can create a world where nuclear weapons can never be used again. Thank you for listening.
Mana Kharrazi currently serves as the Rapid Response Campaign Director for MoveOn and helps lead the No War campaign. Among her many accomplishments, Mana is the former Executive Director of Iranian Alliances Across Borders, EAB, an organization that strengthens the Iranian diaspora here in the U.S. and empowers youth. Mana led EAB during its legal battle, EAB versus Trump, the first lawsuit against the Muslim ban 3.0, blocking the ban and winning in the Fourth Circuit. Mana was also the volunteer educational director of Emergency Response Center International, a Greek refugee organization, and she developed programs for youth in Greek refugee camps. Mana and her work have appeared on BBC, CNN, Frontline, and Huffington Post, and she has written for The Guardian and The Washington Post. Mana, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
As of this taping, we are a few days out from the shootings in Atlanta on March 16th at Young's Asian Massage Parlor, Aromatherapy Spa, and Gold Spa that killed 8 people. 6 of the victims were identified as Asian and 7 were women, coming during a time of increasing attacks on Asian American and Pacific Islander communities. We've seen too many reports about rising anti-Asian violence since the pandemic began. In your role as a campaign director at MoveOn, what do you see as the factors at play?
So it's interesting because I actually am also from Atlanta and I live here and I'm in Atlanta right now. You know, what's interesting is the fact that this happened in Georgia, given the role that AAPI voters in particular played in the runoffs for the Senate and also in the general election. I think we all in a lot of ways have let down our AAPI community members. We saw the huge number of unprecedented voters in Georgia in particular from these communities. And a lot of us right after the election were celebrating the fact that some of the folks had been voting for the first time. I remember reading about how there were Korean women who for the very first time in their lives had registered to vote in any country. And instead of seeing that as an alarm, and recognizing that the fact that there was such an unprecedented number of people voting should have been a wake-up call for us about the increased discrimination they were facing. We celebrated it as a moment of, look at the voters. I think what's going down in Georgia right now is important in particular for us to recognize because we're seeing voter suppression laws, we're seeing increased discrimination, and what happened this week shouldn't ever happen. We shouldn't allow it to happen again, and yet we didn't recognize all of the signs before. So in a lot of ways, I think what we need to recognize, and this is something I think communities of color and diaspora communities in particular have always felt, whenever there's some sort of statement or policy in the foreign policy sector, it always plays domestically. And this is just a reflection of the domestic side of what happens with foreign policy. Trump failed this country when it came to COVID. And instead of recognizing that he failed and taking responsibility for his failures, he scapegoated and he increased the amount of discrimination against AAPI community members he catapulted xenophobia to another level in this country. And I think that that's something that time and again, I know I felt it in my community too, that when there is some sort of policy, when there's some sort of scapegoating of this is the villain in the story, that those communities domestically always have to pay the consequences. I think we have to recognize communities like our AAPI community members not just as political opportunities when it comes time for elections, but also the political consequences of that. And I'm hoping that now we can actually show up for them. And there are a lot of organizations that do incredible work, like Asian Americans Advancing Justice. There are a lot of organizations that are also doing good work around Black voters. And so what I think people can do now in particular is the way we flooded our volunteerism, our funds, our support for these organizations around the election. I think we need to do that now in terms of what these communities need in between those moments as well.
Thank you so much for sharing that experience and that perspective. Now, looking more broadly, you mentioned that you're down in Atlanta, and your work over the past decade as a community leader and organizer includes racial justice, identity-based, and youth leadership movement work. It's spanned the post 9/11 era and has been in different regions of the world, including the South. So with that incredible breadth of experience, what are you seeing in terms of how are movements and movement work changing? What are you most excited about when it comes to how we organize and where we push for equity and justice?
Yeah, I think one thing that's been true about my career is I'm really blessed to have worked with young people. And that's where my passion is. That's also if you ever need just an energy boost, like be around youth. It's incredible. I think as a country, what I'm really excited about for us is that our youngest generation, Gen Z in particular, are the most diverse generation we've ever seen in this country. And that they're growing up at a time when there's increased hate, they're dealing with school shootings, they're dealing with all sorts of hate crimes. We've had all sorts of crises around democracy. There's issues around technology and how that's impacting them as a generation. And in spite of all of that, I think that's, if anything, that's helped shape a very intersectional lens for them. This generation in particular is really well-versed. And in a way that my generation of millennials, we haven't always been really great at showing up for moments. Gen Z just surpassed all expectations when it came to the election. And in general, when it comes to issues, they show up. They really understand it. That's what I'm most excited about, is the fact that for young folks, they see the connections between all of these policies. They see the connections between the policies we have and also how they shape what's going on domestically and within all of these communities. And if anything, that gives me hope for the future. And I remember when I started doing youth work, there was one fact that I always considered, which is if you get someone to register to vote when they're in high school, you'll have a lifelong voter. These folks that we've gotten engaged, I think that they're on the path to continue that level of engagement. And if anything, I'm really excited for their leadership. Another thing about movements and movement work that I'm excited about is that there are more organizations working in coordination with each other. The 2016 election had a profoundly terrible impact on so many communities and on so many issues. And Trump, in a lot of ways, brought to surface what a lot of communities, particularly communities of color, have been feeling. Everything that people in the past may have thought was something that we'd already overcome. In a lot of ways, Trump showed that there are still these deep divisions and that there are policies and systems in place that are harming folks. And I think in a way, both in terms of the diaspora communities that have come together, working together, communities as part of the movement for Black Lives, you have reproductive justice organizations, climate change. There's so many different areas of work that in the past were siloed that are now finally coming together and working. So even just what's going on with the Green New Deal and in terms of talking about green jobs, and there's so many coalitions that I think are realizing that if they actually work in collaboration with each other, don't get in each other's way and don't compete, that they can actually move forward their agendas in a much more effective way. And I think we're also seeing a need for our communities to be much more educated. and well-versed in what's happening on the Hill. So it's not just a siloed discussion that's occurring. I know in foreign policy, typically it's older white folks that have really been at the helm of all of that. But the communities that are the most impacted are not older white folks. It's all of these diaspora communities. It's the communities of color that end up fighting these wars. It's the communities of color that have to deal with all of the weaponry. When we have an overinflated Pentagon budget, where do the surplus weapons go? They come back here and are used against these communities. And I think for the first time, we're seeing that. People are starting to understand that, and that narrative can build out, and that there are opportunities for us to really work together. So that's what I'm most excited about, is that there have been a lot of crises and struggles. There is a lot of inequity. There's also just so much more opportunity for us. And so I'm hopeful about the future if we continue on this path, that we can work together to actually respond to those issues and address them together.
One area I would love to learn more about, there's a conversation I had in 2017 that really stuck with me with Becky Rafter, who at the time was leading Georgia WAND. And she said, "You don't understand. The South is seeing an incredible network of organizing, and electorally you will start to see it break blue." And sure enough, you start to see those changes. And I'd love to learn more about what is happening, what has been happening, and where you see that energy and why that's happening.
Yeah, I think in particular in organizing, a lot of folks are realizing, Georgia organizers in particular, are a little bit more protective about the work they do. But I think that's a reflection of they've had to be scrappy for years. It's under-resourced organizations that don't get a lot of attention. And even when they engage in national spaces, it's difficult to talk about, because the majority of human rights violations, the majority of these policies that are suppressing voters, all sorts of things happen in the South. It's, an incredibly diverse region. And I think people kind of forget that. The image of the South they have is just so antiquated. But it's also a region that has this rich history of civil rights. The worst labor laws are here. You have some of the best labor organizers. When you talk about climate, there's a real racial justice element to it in the South. When we talk about Cancer Alley and all of these things that we've known about the death penalty, and just looking at Texas, climate change just in the past few months, there's so many different stories. And when there have been big crises, and I think we have to remember, this is also the region where Katrina occurred. And there was a big discrepancy in the kind of resources that came down to the South. Organizers realized a lot of folks are going to talk on their behalf. National resources aren't always getting into the hands of the people that need it and the people that are doing the work. And that's definitely shifted in the last 15 years since Katrina. And I think that that's partially more organizers being able to engage in those spaces nationally, but also realizing that these fights are in a lot of ways ground zero in the South. If we want to talk about voting rights on a national level, we got to recognize what's happening in the South. If we want to talk about all of these policies that have been happening in North Carolina, the way that it's shifted because of gerrymandering, again, there's a lot of lessons to be learned from the South. There's also rich opportunities here as well. And so I'm excited about the collaboration that's happening, but anyone who's lived down here could tell you it was going to turn blue. And that as soon as it turned blue, there were going to be a huge set of laws that were going to ensure that it never did again. So I think one is we got to keep focusing on the South and supporting our folks down here who do the great organizing. Another thing is just recognizing that there's a lot of power here. There's a lot of history. Some of the most successful movements of resistance are down here. And that history is something that folks haven't forgotten, because there are elders that are still living among all of us that are organizers from all of those previous fights. And there's a whole crop of really incredible young organizers too that are doing the work. And that it's all relational. You can't do anything in the South without a relationship, and it can't be transactional. So I think for me, as a young organizer, when this was my stomping grounds, and I learned from incredible organizers that were older than me, I saw a lot of lessons and parallels that I, as an Iranian American organizer, took into organizing within my community. It definitely shaped me as an organizer, and something that I'm going to be grateful for the rest of my life.
So actually, I wanted to talk more about your work at EOB. Now, as we mentioned at the beginning, you led Iranian Alliances Across Borders, which for our listeners is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that aims to strengthen the Iranian diaspora and empower its youth. And also, as we mentioned, EOB was a part of the first lawsuit against the Muslim Ban 3.0, blocking the ban and winning in the Fourth Circuit. What made you move your work with youth and refugee communities to working on the Muslim ban and anti-war efforts?
After a couple years of doing great organizing in the South and being part of that, I shifted to focusing on the Iranian American community. Anyone who's dealt with our diaspora community in particular knows there are deep divisions. It's not always been a very healthy community, and I have so much love and compassion for everyone because everyone in my family has a memory of the revolution. I have older siblings and parents who lived through it. I'm the only one who grew up in the US. And when I think you're that close, your proximity to trauma, it's going to be complicated. There's a lot of pain. And that's why I think there's so many different segments in our community. But I got to focus on youth and organizing our next generation and helping them reconcile the trauma and the baggage we got from our families and understanding our position in this country as really the first generation that fully grew up here. My English is better than my Persian. I've only really lived in the United States. There's just differences in my experience. There's also a difference in terms of my entitlement. I am American. No one can take that away from me in a way that's not true for my parents. And so I have a sense of wanting to belong in this country. And anyone who ever challenges that, I'm going to take issue with in a way that my immigrant parents wouldn't, right? So I love that work that I got to do with them. And I started noticing the difference in each wave of youth I worked with. I started as a youth organizer. I was just barely out of college when I started working with EOB. And through the years, I started noticing the moment that the wave of students I was working with could not remember a time before Fox News. I remember when I started realizing that they only knew what post 9/11 America was like, and that wasn't something that was true for us. But then when the Trump administration came into power, just in those couple years before during the campaigning, and then when the presidency, the new administration came into power, we saw a huge wave of discrimination, more experiences from our young folks being harassed on campuses or even in the subway in New York. And when that first wave of the executive orders came through for the Muslim ban, I remember just seeing my community members across the world being scattered and stuck in airports and people trying to figure out how they were going to get their parents or their uncles and aunts to come back home. I remember one couple where the wife and the baby were stuck in Iran and the husband was in the US. They were here on student visas and he just happened to take an earlier flight. Just the response we had to have as a community in ensuring that our community members were okay. And all of these, for years, all these lessons I told our young folks about their role as people who could be agents of change, who could shape their community. For the first time, it was this moment where I was like, I gotta walk the walk. I'm talking all the time about how they can really step up as leaders. And here I am in this moment where I could really do the same thing as someone who was so close to the impacted communities and also understood how to organize and campaign and how policies actually could be shifted and changed. I took on that role and we had an incredible legal crew. Our legal team was made up of Muslim advocates and Americans United for the Separation of Church and State. And just that those two organizations, that vision was beautiful for me as an Iranian American to be part of, and Covington and Burling. So it was like a powerhouse group of civil rights lawyers that were fighting on our behalf. And before we really entered the scene, I remember listening to some of the earlier hearings within the earlier executive orders and recognizing that nobody was really talking about our community. the impact on humans was kind of being forgotten in this, philosophical debate about the role of the president and who has power. There was no conversation about the actual impact and very little visibility of any of those folks. And I, as a citizen, as someone who was naturalized, had access and privilege in a way that other folks didn't. So that's kind of the work I got to do and be a part of. And it, took me through all of the hearings and all of the moments and the crisis, but then also I got to be a part of the No Ban Act and in helping our members of Congress, our champions, introduce it on the Hill. And for me, it was the idea that I didn't want our young people to have the same experience I did. I thought we had gotten to a position as a community that was going to be different. And in a lot of ways, it felt like that policy was saying that people like us shouldn't exist, that it's inconceivable that in one human, you can have someone be both Iranian and American, that there's something that's wrong about that, and that's a contradiction. And it felt like we needed to protect that and preserve that. And also, I remember after the hearing, there was a hearing when the policy was actually implemented. I remember in early December when they overruled the injunction. And what happened was basically one of our young folks came up to me at this vigil for an Iranian American who had been killed by police in Virginia, Bijan Reza. And he came up to me at this vigil at the Lincoln Memorial. And this is someone who was born in New York. His parents are professors at these established universities. His mom's done all this work at Columbia and born and bred here. And he told me, I don't think this is a place for me anymore. That's what they're telling me with this policy. And that's really what drove me for a really long time, was ensuring that people didn't feel that way and that they still had access to their families and that there wasn't that kind of internalized hatred, or at least that we could in our own way combat that. Right at the beginning of January 2020, I was planning on transitioning out of that role. I was going to go take a little break. I was going to go traveling and come back and reassess what I'd want to do next. And then Soleimani was killed and we were at the brink of war. And I, as an Iranian American, never really wanted to work on Iran. And I know that sounds strange, but I was happy with working in the community space. And really my idea was like, if I can just help empower a group of young folks, give them the space to reconcile their identities, help combat these policies that are preventing them from seeing their families and causing more trauma for them, that this group of young folks could really shift things in this country. They could become leaders and develop their communities, and that we would be in a much better place than we were when I was growing up in the early 90s with family that was telling me not to mention I'm Iranian in public spaces because of their experiences around the 80s and their safety. I was hoping that this next generation would really be able to move that in a different direction. And then when the threat of war came, everything was out the window because it was the thing we'd all grown up fearing. It was the worst case scenario, our nightmare scenario. I still have a lot of family in Iran. I have family all over the world, as many other Iranians do throughout the diaspora. But that threat of war, that feeling of being a joke in all the memes, that even the people that were against the war still didn't even see us, of feeling so invisible and hated, and the need for us to know that, like, we're a really young diaspora community. If it's left just to us to do anything, we're not going to be able to do anything on our own. We're still divided about what the future of Iran is. And honestly, at the end of the day, like, I don't live in Iran. I don't experience those policies. It's not my decision to make, but I can get out of their way. That's the plan I have, is to live in the United States for the rest of my life. It's a place I love, but what I can do is ensure that it doesn't get in the way of what's best for Iranians. And to see that, and to be so close to the stories. And even now, like my uncle told me recently, a couple weeks ago, that they're not going to get the vaccine till 2023. For 2 years after our pandemic is over, I'm going to be hearing about COVID every time I call my family. And the guilt that I'm going to feel about that, the fact that I feel so helpless and knowing I can't do anything about it, I don't know what to do with that. And the only way I can understand to do anything is to be able to ensure that I'm using my voice here, because I know that they can't use their voice in the same way there.
So as we now have an opportunity to change U.S. policy and approaches to the U.S.-Iran relationship, what opportunities and challenges do you see?
I think anything Biden does has to be better than what Trump did, obviously, because Trump's maximum pressure policies failed. And in a lot of ways, we're farther away from diplomacy and any sense of stability in that region than we were at the beginning of Trump's administration. Ultimately, Americans don't want to have the United States play an ongoing role in the region. We have 2 wars that have gone on, the longest wars in our history. And I think that I can say unequivocally, Americans want the United States to withdraw from the 2 wars as responsibly as possible and to ensure that there's some stability in the region. Unfortunately, we've seen bullying is not the option. There's no power in bullying. And if the Biden administration wants to really show leadership, the best way to show strength and leadership is diplomacy. That's the only path we have. And that's the path that's most likely to ensure the greatest legacy, both for this administration and for the generation that we are responsible to. We have young folks who have grown up with the backdrop of war their entire lives. It's time for us to take a different path. And I hope that President Biden understands that he has a great opportunity to show his leadership and strength by taking the path of diplomacy.
What are you seeing from MoveOn members?
That's a great question. I think MoveOn members, and we're the largest grassroots organization in the country. MoveOn currently has 15 million members. And I think they've played a tremendous role, both in terms of getting us to the agreement and talking about how to end the blockade in Yemen. At every turn, MoveOn members have been active in ensuring that we pick that path to diplomacy. I think in particular right now, MoveOn members are looking for us to move beyond our current policies, to move away from Trump's bullying and maximum pressure, and to give an opportunity for us to have a different path in that region and to really focus on our own domestic issues. And we can't really do much domestically if we continue to have an overinflated budget and spending money on 2 wars that we absolutely do not need to be in.
People will bring up Iran's human rights violations as reasons not to engage or not to actually re-enter the deal. What would you say to that?
The consequences of a lot of these policies, particularly maximum pressure, is that minorities, religious and ethnic minorities, impoverished folks are the people that are the most vulnerable and impacted. The human rights violations, the arrests of human rights activists and political protesters, the effect that it's had on the Kurdish community and the Baluchi communities in Iran, all of that's worse. I'm Kurdish and Iranian, and constantly in different spaces listening to those conversations. I think one thing folks forget, and I think that's intentionally probably masked in this conversation of what to do and diplomacy that's important to acknowledge, is that when we think about human rights, when we think about policies that are atrocious, none of those can be figured out if we don't even sit at the table to negotiate them. There is an opportunity to bring up these issues and to ensure that for the future they're in a stronger position. No deal is ever perfect, but it can definitely not be improved if we don't even try to negotiate it. And I think that's what's important to remember, is there's an opportunity to address issues like human rights. There's an opportunity to ensure that we're in a better position. It doesn't come from bullying. It has to come from diplomacy. It has to come from at least sitting at the same table and having the conversation.
Mana, thank you so much for taking time to come on today. You've talked about the power of taking that first step in diplomacy as true leadership what you reminded me of today was the power of stories in encouraging us to take those paths. I know you're really busy right now with everything going on and all the preparations for the new year. So thank you for coming on, and Nowruz Piruz.
Thank you for having me. Nowruz Mubarak.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced and edited by Derek Sender, Will Lowry, and Delphine Vigil, with research and assistance from Doreen Horschig and Harry Tarpey. Sound design by Derek Sender. Audio engineering by Derek Sender and Will Lowry. Our theme song is by Lyricsborn and the Poets of Rhythm, sampled with kind permission. Additional music by San Francisco-based bands 17 Evergreen and the Society of Rockets. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit plowshares.org.